Okay, so we're going to be looking at Chapter 7 on modality, and I'd like you to read as far as page 1, 2, 3. So you can do, if you wish, read about quantification, but I'm not going to concern myself with that part of the chapter. So I'm just going to deal with modality and take you up to page 1, 2, 3 in Griffiths. Okay, so here's a great poem by Shel Silverstein that you may be familiar with, Woulda, Coulda, Shoulda. And this cute little poem neatly illustrates the difference between modality and tense. All the woulda, coulda, shouldas laying in the sun, talking about the things they woulda, coulda, shoulda done. But those woulda, coulda, shouldas all run away and hid from one little did. Okay, so as you can see, modality is a way of talking about a particular action, maybe not actually doing the action. Okay, put that in better terms. Modality is a commentary on the level of either necessity, what we're going to call Deontic modality, and possibility, what we're going to call epistemic modality. So if we say something, and we usually say something like this, oh gee, I should have started my paper earlier. Well, we're talking about a comment on the necessity of the fact that we should have started it earlier. We probably did start it, but we started it late. So we're making a comment about that, about the time that we did start. She might be home by 10. Again, it's expressing the possibility based upon what you know about her schedule, that there's a possibility that she could be home by 10. So in the first one there, it's what we call deontic modality. In the second one, it's what we call epistemic. Just to make a distinction here between modality and tense. When we talk about the habitual simple aspect, there's a way of talking about that using what appears to be a modal. Actually, it's not. Okay, so previously we would meet every New Year, but not anymore. And so the would here is not so much expressing modality, it's expressing an habitual action. Similarly, for last year, I could run for an hour or more, but not now. So again, the could is talking with the past of can, talking about the particular habitual action in the past. And again, we can talk about a diamond will cut glass, talking about its particular capability. And in this sense, we're not talking about using it in terms of modality, but in terms of habituality. Okay, just to make a distinction here between tense and modality. And this is something that's captured by the use of double modals. You may be familiar with the use of double modals in dialects like Appalachian English, which probably derived from Scottish English, where double modals are quite common. And what we have in English is these two particular forms, as we've said before, modality and tense, housed in the same particular word. So if you think of could and should, they're really ambiguous. They have both what we can call indicative or tense meaning, and they have a subjunctive sense or modal sense. So a sentence like "I could come" is ambiguous between the first meaning, I was able to come, the past indicative of can, and second meaning, I would be able to come, subjunctive. So I could come if something happens, right? So in English, we have this ambiguity, which in other languages like German is actually captured by two different forms. So in German, we have two forms. These two forms are distinct. So the first one, the indicative, is distinguished from the subjunctive. So the first one there is I could come, which is the past indicative of can. And the second one there we can capture as I might could come or I may could come, okay? Which has an epistemic meaning. So in a language like German, this ambiguity does not exist. We have two separate forms. So the notion of a double modal then is responding to the second form. It's distinguishing between the indicative meaning, of, say, of could, and the subjunctive or modal meaning of could, or epistemic meaning of could, as in I might could come or I may could come. Okay. There's various classifications of modals. This is Quirk et al., and they distinguish what they call intermediate verbs from auxiliaries and main verbs. And then they make a distinction in terms of these intermediate verbs. And so what we're mainly concerned with today are our central modals. And we'll also probably look at some marginal modals as well. But notice there are other kinds of modality. Look at semi-auxiliaries. And we'll look at have to, of course, but other ones similar to that: be about to, be able to, be bound to, be going to, be supposed to. Perhaps a classification that you're perhaps more familiar with is Celce-Murcia and Larsen-Freeman's big thick grammar book. And there they take the central modals, as they call, Quirk calls them, and then they look at phrasal modals that carry the same meaning. So the central modal, or modal can, could, often goes together with the phrasal modal, be able to. Will and shall, be going to and be about to, must and have to, and that's a neat distinction with must and have to. Okay, so let's talk about the two main notions of modality, epistemic and deontic. Epistemic comes from the Greek episteme and has to do with knowledge. Okay, the linguistic expression of an evaluation of the chances that a certain hypothetical state of affairs under consideration, or some aspect of it, will occur, is occurring, or has occurred. Okay, so in other words, we're not totally sure about this, but we have some kind of basis for making some kind of assertion about the strength of the fact that something occurred, is occurring, or will occur in the future. To continue, and this estimation of likelihood is situated on a scale going from certainty, that the state of affairs applies, via a neutral or agnostic stance towards its occurrence, to certainty that it does not apply, with intermediary positions on the positive and the negative side of the scale. So we're talking about a scale that distinguishes between that must be Tony at the door, and then moving down the scale of certainty, that might be Tony at the door, and then going negative, that can't be Tony at the door. Here's some examples of epistemic modality and the differing strengths. So we can say, for example, that is Jimmy at the door, not Tony this time, but Jimmy. That is Jimmy. Well, we're not expressing any modality, we know for certain. That will be Mary at the door. That must be Jim calling. We're pretty certain. Less certain, that may be the mail. That might have been your best paper yet. Maya should be arriving soon. That's probably her now. And here we're expressing a modality through an adverb. Okay, deontic. Again, it's from the Greek, this time deon, which refers to obligation, duty. And it indicates how the world ought to be according to certain norms, expectations, speaker desires, etc. Okay. And here's some examples of deontic modality. You might want to use a different word here. Interesting, this one. It's the kind of hedging that an instructor would write on a paper. What they're actually saying is it's directing you to change that. You should use APA format. Okay, definitely a direction there in terms of a set of norms. You will do exactly as I tell you. Wow, there's a strong case of duty. And you must have a reference section, of course. How could you not? You may hand in your paper late. Oh, thank you, Professor. Thank you for relaxing the norms a little there. And you can use an electronic calculator for the test. That's permission. Okay, so these are all examples of deontic modality, which refer to sets of norms, expectations, duties, obligations, etc. What we know, of course, is that the same expressions can be either epistemic or deontic. So compare these then. It may be dark by the time we are finished. Okay, that is epistemic, right? You may have 2 slices of cake, but no more. Oh, you're giving me permission. Thank you. That's deontic. The tide should be turning now. That's clearly epistemic. You should try harder. I know I should. I'm sorry. She's got to be one of the tallest in her class. Okay, epistemic. She's got to be more careful. Notice the distinction there. We talk about deontic modality in reference to people who can change their situations. So she's got to be more careful. In the first one there, she's got to be one of the tallest in her class. It's not as though she can become one of the tallest in her class. You can't direct her to become tall. We're talking about the degree of certainty that you have that within that class she's the tallest. Next one, she expected the weather to be cold, but it was warm. She thought, expressing a degree of commentary on something that's going to happen. And contrast that with she expected her children to be polite, which is definitely deontic. They need to conform and use the magic word. It might rain tomorrow, okay? And might I have another piece of cake, please? Very, very polite. You can often distinguish deontic modality by please insertion, as in that last one there. Might I have another piece of cake, please? It might rain tomorrow, please. No. You should try harder, please. You should try harder. Yes, it works there. So with deontic, often a test of deontic modality is please insertion. Okay, going a little further, the same sentence may be given an epistemic or a deontic interpretation. Okay. So you must be crazy. Okay. And perhaps the first meaning that comes to meaning that mind there is the epistemic one. You're making an assessment of somebody's behavior. Uh, you must be crazy. Okay, it's epistemic. Think of about a Deontic context. In this coming scene, you're deranged. You must be crazy in this scene. Okay, so it's a direction to conform to a set of behavior, right? They may come tomorrow. I don't know. It's possible. You know, they should. You know, they're getting the train, and they did say they'd come, so there's a possibility. And they may come tomorrow, meaning they're allowed to come. Maybe your friend's parent says to child, yes, your friends may come tomorrow. I will allow that. Notice that this ambiguity is kind of similar to the ambiguity in she ran 5 miles, which can have a discrete meaning, a one event thing, or it can have an habitual meaning, or she ran 5 miles every day. Okay, that was her habit. Okay, so the epistemic deontic distinction is parallel to the single event habitual interpretations of simple aspect forms. What distinguishes the meaning we take from it, of course, is the pragmatic context. Okay. In each case, the distinction is pragmatic, a context-dependent overlay on a semantic core that is indifferent to the distinction. So we take our meaning based upon a particular pragmatic context, context-dependent. We can capture that, and it often happens that there is this ambiguity in modal meaning. Here's a little extract from Mallory Robinson's novel Housekeeping. And one of the protagonists said, one of them said, she looks so sad. And Sylvie replied, well, she is sad. Silence. Sylvie said, she should be sad. She laughed. I don't mean she should be, but, you know, who wouldn't be? So what she's saying there, not that she, it's not a deontic meaning she's giving to she should be sad. It's an epistemic one based upon what she knows about this person's situation. You know, lots of things didn't work out for her, so, you know, she should be sad, right? Not that she ought to be sad, she must be sad, right? And so often we have that ambiguity, and only context can begin to illuminate the meanings we're trying to express. Just a couple of things in terms of corpus linguistics. Corpus linguistics studies the particular cotext and the occurrence. What we can say, and these are general statements, is that epistemic sentences tend to have non-human subjects and state verbs. So in that sentence, the tide should be turning now. Tide is a non-human subject. So there's a tendency to have that, and also a tendency to have state verbs. With deontic sentences, because they're talking about people and norms and duties, they tend to have human subjects and tend to be have activity and other non-state verbs. Okay, you must do your homework. You, of course, a person, a human subject, and do your homework, activity verb. Those are just general statements, of course. Okay, why do we use epistemic modality? Well, epistemic modality is used, for example, the mail carrier must be on time, when the contextually relevant presuppositions, you look outside the window and you see that Mrs. Jones already has her mail. She's at her doorstep, or she's bringing it in, okay? And so that's a factual proposition from which you can make an inference. that presuppositions is not sufficient to establish the truth of the proposition. The mail carrier is on time being communicated. Okay, so just because we see Mrs. Jones across the road taking in her mail does not mean that the um, mail carrier is on time, because, for example, Mrs. Jones could be collecting the mail from the previous day because she was away today. But it appears to be a factual proposition from which you can make a pretty good guess. Yeah, the mail carrier must be on time because this is the time every day that the mail comes. Mrs. Jones has got her mail, therefore I must have my mail, therefore the mail carrier is on time. So the speaker is going beyond the available evidence and making inferences regarding what the actual situation was, is currently, or will be. And that's how we use epistemic modality. And we'll later tie that in to Grice's notion of the particular maxims of telling the truth, of quality. All the time we're faced with having to hedge what we're saying in terms of modality because we don't have all the particular factual information to be certain about something. Interpreting modality as epistemic or deontic. Epistemic interpretation arises when the presuppositions are assumed to be facts or common knowledge. Mrs. Jones has her mail. Deontic interpretation arises when preferences, wishes, requirements, or recommendations form the contextual presuppositions. For example, our lives depend upon it. Therefore, you must do something. You ought to do something. You should do something. This is taken from Griffiths, and what he's attempting to do is distinguish the use of modals based upon the types of propositions presupposed, which is in the third column. Must, has to, will is based upon factual propositions. Okay, the mail carrier must be on time. P is true in all plausible scenarios based on the presuppositions. So what you're going to say, the particular inference you're going to make, is true in all plausible scenarios based upon the presuppositions, the factual presuppositions. Mrs. Jones has her mail, therefore the mail carrier must be on time, and that is true in all plausible scenarios. We can weaken that if we drop down to may and might. Okay. Again, we're basing our inferences on factual propositions, but now it's just at least one plausible scenario based on the presupposition. Does not rule out P. Okay. So this is a less degree of certainty that we're expressing here. Which shouldn't, ought to. What we're looking at is norms here. P is true in all plausible scenarios based upon the presuppositions, and those presuppositions are particular norms. We'll look at can later in terms of dynamic modality. And this is another type of modality, and it tends to be coming from epistemic modality. So we've made this distinction between deontic and talked about social constraints, and we've talked about epistemic, which are based on inferential constraints. And we can also distinguish another kind of modality coming off here, which we call dynamic. And these constraints originate in the person, animal, or machine, if we're not talking about human subjects. So let's see if we can explore this and distinguish first between dynamic and deontic modality. So dynamic modality does not express the speaker's opinion, nor does the speaker affect the situation. He can speak perfect French. Okay, that's not expressing my opinion. I'm not asking this person giving this permission to speak perfect French. It's a comment on this particular person's ability. The speaker's describing a factual situation about the subject of the sentence. In Deontic modality, it's used to affect a situation by giving permission. For example, you can go when you've finished. All right? Here the speaker is giving permission. So Deontic modality is used to control the situation. And see if we can capture that distinction here. My son can speak Japanese very well, dynamic modality, but he can't speak Japanese on Wednesday. Now we're moving to Deontic. Okay, he's not allowed to. Why? Because that's when he studies Chinese. Okay. Consider these are the distinction here between dynamic now and epistemic modality. She must speak Japanese. She lived there for 20 years. So what we're saying is we're using a factual proposition. She lived there for 20 years. And then we're making an inference. Now, as you know, you can live in a country for 20 years. That doesn't mean you speak the language. Okay? But we're using it as a pretty strong indication that she does, and therefore we're going to say she must speak Japanese. We can weaken that inference. For example, she may speak Japanese. Taiwan was occupied by the Japanese when she was growing up there. Okay. During the 30s, 40s, Taiwan was occupied by the Japanese. Japanese was the language that was taught in schools, and knowing that, well, she may speak Japanese, because not everybody went to school, not everybody studied Japanese. When we get to 3, though, we're moving to dynamic modality. She can speak Japanese. She's a news anchor on NHK. Okay, in a sense, we're not basing it upon a factual proposition here. We're supporting the comment that she can speak Japanese with an argument that suggests, yes, that is true. So in 3, she can speak Japanese is dynamic modality. Okay, we talked before about scope, and we looked at that in terms of the word unlockable, not able to be locked, and unlockable, able to be unlocked. And we can use scope to distinguish between must and have to. So if you look at these sentences, you mustn't provide a receipt. You don't have to provide a receipt. You must provide a receipt. You have to provide a receipt. Notice that there's a degree of similarity in meaning between C and D. You must and you have to. But with A and B, there is a distinction. You mustn't provide a receipt. You don't have to provide a receipt, are not the same meaning. So in A, we can gloss this as it is necessary that you not provide a receipt. Notice where the negation is. And we can express that semantically as necessarily, parenthesis, not, parenthesis, you provide a receipt, close parenthesis, close large parenthesis. Or put that in more understandable language, it's necessary that a negative state of affairs prevails. Whereas in B, notice where the not is now, it is not necessary that you provide a receipt. And again, you can contrast where the negation comes. And so what we have is an explanation of the difference between the meaning of don't have to and mustn't. In C and D, what we can see is that they both have to express the same meaning. You can see this again, the similarity between mustn't have and can't have. They mustn't have received the gift. They can't have received the gift. Okay, so they to express the meaning, both have the same meaning, necessarily not they have received the gift. Which is similar to it's not possible that they have received the gift. And we can contrast that with they may not have received the invitation. Okay, and notice the difference here in the particular way that we can gloss that. I think this is the last slide, and perhaps one of the most difficult concepts that second language learners have in understanding, and that's didn't need to versus needn't have to. Needn't have done. So in the first one sentence, I didn't need to prepare all that food. They phoned to say that they wouldn't be coming. It is actually ambiguous, okay? So both of these conclusions are possible. So I used the time to fill out my census form. So that means you didn't do any cooking. And B is also can follow. I can freeze most of it, which suggests you did the cooking, you prepared the food, and therefore you can freeze most of it. Now contrast that with I needn't have prepared all that food. They phoned to say they wouldn't be coming. A does not follow. Okay, so I use the time to fill out my census form. No, because I needn't have prepared all that food has the meaning that you actually did prepare the food. So the only conclusion that can follow is I can freeze most of it. Okay, and so we can see that, and we can semantically map that distinction. In one, it was not necessary to prepare all that food, and in two, it was necessary not to have prepared all that food. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and again, no need to look at quantification.